a lot of you guys know this about me. I grew up in a little bitty town called Eupora, Mississippi, and growing up in Eupora, we used to call it, even where I live, like Eupora is sure enough small town, but we called where I lived up in the sticks. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase before. We lived out in the sticks. And so growing up, we didn't have access to satellite TV. That was kind of new in our area, believe it or not. And so that was something that we didn't really have. And cable TV sure wasn't going to reach out there. Like there was no way they were going to run cable TV out there. So growing up, the only chance we had to watch TV came off of our antenna. Now, if you grew up, you know exactly what I'm talking about in that era. Now, some of you may be thinking like this little TV antenna that you plug into the back of your TV and you just set up on top of the TV to get your local channels. Kind of like it, but not quite. The one we grew up with was the kind where there were certain channels we could get at all points in time. So channel 2, channel 4, and channel 9 we could get at any point in time, right? Anytime you want to watch those, you could watch those 3 channels. But if you wanted to watch channel 6 or you want to watch channel 27, what you had to do is I had to go outside and open up one of our windows in our living room, and I would stand, because this antenna was built up on a big pole, and I would begin to rotate the antenna until my sister was like, oh, nope, go back, nope, oh, right there, right back, go back just a little bit. And then the picture would come in and it wouldn't be fuzzy anymore, right? So this was the TV experience I had growing up, right? So anytime we wanted to watch something, it was kind of an endeavor. And if it was on channel 6, which was ABC, or Fox, channel 27, then that was going to take a family effort, okay, to be able to watch those kind of programming. And so growing up, we didn't get to watch a lot of different shows outside of things that were on channel 2, channel 4, and channel 9. Now, one of the beauties of these channels is there's one channel, channel 2, was PBS. And I'm convinced that it doesn't matter where you live in the world, you can get PBS somewhere. It's on a channel. I always joke, whenever the people decide they're going to go and live on the moon, they're going to get there, and there's going to be 2 things that are going to be there. PBS, you're going to be able to watch PBS, and then there's going to be a Dollar General. Those 2 things will be there when they arrive. And so growing up, PBS, we always got to watch PBS about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There were some other channels like Fox, and you can go out and turn the antenna, and you could watch some cartoons there. But my main source of cartoons that I would watch was channel 2. Well, in the playlist of everything that's running through on the regular channel 2, in the afternoons, there would be this guy that would come on, and his name was Bob Ross. Now, a lot of you in this room know who I'm talking about. We've talked about him before, but some of you are going to have no idea who Bob Ross is. So this is a picture of Bob Ross that you can see here on the screen. So despite the screen before, it's not Naomi. That is Bob Ross that we see there. He was an artist that would come on Channel 2, and he would paint these beautiful outdoor scenes is what he was known to paint. And he was an incredible artist, and he would take that little color palette he's got in his hand, and he would paint all of these things. And he's known for not only his artistic ability, but really like the myth of Bob Ross, if you will, that kind of rose, was because he would talk in this very smooth voice as he's painting, and he would have these sayings like, I'm going to paint these little happy trees, and we're going to make these beautiful clouds. And he would have all these sayings that he had that go along with the things that he would paint, because every day he was painting something similar, like something with some happy trees and some birds and some sunrises and that kind of thing. And I remember when he would come on, I'd be like, oh, goodness. You're like, yeah, Bob, you take forever. Like, come on, man. Like, you got to get through with this. Like, we got cartoons on the other side of this. But at least the only thing that I really picked up on Bob Ross, outside of the little sayings that he would have there, is when he would begin to paint something, he would start, and you would be thinking, man, there's no way that's going to become a happy little tree. Okay? Like, you just did a little black dot there. I don't know what that means. Or he would say, like, I'm going to paint a sunrise. And he would start with like a glob of orange, and he would just put it on there. And I was going, boy, you really going to have to work your magic on this one, Bob, because that does not look like a sunrise. Nowhere near a sunrise. But then every single episode, right, at the end of it, you're going, man, he did it. Like, that is actually like a legitimate sunrise over the Rocky Mountains. Like incredible artistry. And so that, some of that is why he rose to fame, right? Some of it comes of like kind of the myth, I said, of who he is. But then he was legitimately talented, very talented artist. And so, as you know, like with any good artist, whether that's a sculptor, painter, writer, anything, they can begin with something that you look at and you're going, I don't know how you're going to make that look like what you want it to look like. But then at the end of it, as the audience, we're kind of stuck with this going, man, you actually did that. Like, you actually accomplished to what you set out to accomplish. And so this morning, as we talk about a very difficult topic in grief, and we talk about losing loved ones, I want us to keep this imagery of an artist in the back of our minds. I want us to think about God in this conversation this morning as if God is the cosmic artist. and that he knows the end that he is going to bring about. And we as the audience, we aren't quite sure how it's going to get there. We might have some ideas of what the end's going to look like, but we don't know exactly how God is going to get there. And we're wondering the whole time, how is he going to bring about what he intends, especially when we walk through difficulty within our life. When we walk through the loss of a loved one, the tragedy of losing someone. Like, it can make us question, like, where's this whole thing going? Like, what is happening right now? And so our goal this morning is I want us to learn to trust the artist. I want us to know that we can trust the great artist. And so I'm going to walk as tenderly and as graciously as I possibly can, because there is no pain like losing a loved one. There just isn't. It is one of the most horrific, painful things that we walk through, if not the most horrific, painful thing we walk through in our lives, is losing someone that we love. There's truly nothing like it. So I want to walk tenderly and I want to walk very carefully within this topic, but our goal at the end of this, at the end of the teaching this morning, our goal is that we can walk away trusting the great artist, the great cosmic artist, if you will, as we talk about God. Now, that does not mean in our trust of him that we don't get mad, we don't get upset with him at moments, but it just means even in our deepest areas, in our deepest times of pain, we can still learn to trust. And we're going to see that in this book of Ruth. And so, as I said at the beginning, we'll be in the book of Ruth, and we're going to be focusing on the character in the book of Ruth. Her name's Naomi. Naomi is actually the main character of the book of Ruth. I don't know why they chose Ruth, but chose Ruth as the name, but Naomi is the main character. The story begins with Naomi and it ends with Naomi. And so she is the character that kind of undergirds the entire plot of the story of the book of Ruth. And what we will see is, as we'll highlight different portions of Naomi's story as we walk through the book of Ruth, and we will see that she goes through unimaginable pain that people typically do not walk through the depth of pain that she walks through. But then we'll get to see the journey of her learning to trust the great artist. This is the storyline that we trace throughout the book of Ruth. So we're in a way this morning we're going to do an overview of the book of Ruth as we walk through the storyline and everything that takes place. But we're going to begin in chapter 1, verse 1, just learning about who she is and what she walks through. And so we'll start in verse 1. We'll read down through verse 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of her 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went to the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, the 2 sons, took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died. So that the woman, Naomi, was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So when we open up the book of Ruth, we see the character, her name is Naomi. Now, in ancient Hebrew times, you would name a child according to their disposition and who you desired them to be. And so Naomi, the name Naomi carries with it the theme of pleasantness. And so this is what her parents would have seen in her. This is also what she would have been striving to live, would have been this air of pleasantness around her. But as we quickly see within the story of Naomi, is that her life is anything but pleasant. So it begins in difficulty, but then it quickly progresses into tragedy. So it begins in the difficulty of her and her husband and her sons have to leave Bethlehem, and they have to go to the country of Moab, which is over east of Israel. So they have to go and settle in a land that's not their homeland because there's a famine taking place in Bethlehem. And while they get there, when they settle in Moab, Naomi loses her husband, Elimelech. He dies. So she's walking through the tragedy of that, and while walking through the tragedy and the grief of all that, she also loses her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. So there is deep sense of loss that she is experiencing at this particular time. This is why I would say she endures unimaginable tragedy. She has lost the 3 men in her lives that she loves deeply. And this pain that Naomi has experienced is highlighted in the way that the Hebrew writer writes this down. So in verse 5, when he says, when we see the mention of sons, the word in the Hebrew word that is used there for son is a word that is used to describe children, not married men. So the author is very intentional of using a word in the Hebrew language that doesn't just apply to a grown man, but it applies to a child. And he does this to show us the depths of her loss. So it's not just that she lost her husband. It's not just that she lost her sons. No, she lost her babies. That's how she viewed her 2 sons. So much like moms will say typically today, you'll hear moms say something like, you may be a grown man, but you'll always be my baby. Right? Like, you are dear to me. You are my son. Like, this is something that moms even today say. So this is what the writer of Ruth is pointing out. He's going, she lost her sons, yes, but she lost her babies. And in the midst of that tragedy, she also is grieving the loss of her husband that she has lost as well. So she goes from difficulty and having to deal with the famine, settled in a foreign land, to losing the ones that she deeply loves. Now, typically, this is where we would expect the story to go, but then she trusted in God and everything was better. And that's the Sunday school version of the story that we get, right? She trusted in God and everything was better. Everything wraps up beautifully, which is partially true, but it really misses out the purpose of the story of the book of Ruth. Because what we notice here is Naomi, as we will see in just a moment, she is going to go walk through more difficulty and more. We're going to see her deal with the grief that she's walking through. She just doesn't blow through it and be like, I trusted God and everything was fine. That is not her life at all. So to summarize what takes place as we're moving through this book, Naomi hears that the famine in Bethlehem has ended. And so she decides she's going to return home. That's where her people are. So she's going to return back home to Bethlehem. So she goes to her daughter-in-laws they've been all living together. And she says, hey, you need to stay here in Moab. You need to stay here because that increases your possibility of being able to be remarried, and so someone can take care of you within this culture. That was her purpose. So the 2 daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, Orpah says, that sounds good to me. I'll stay here with my family, remarry, and continue on my life. Ruth looks at her and says, no, I'm going to cling to you. I'm going to travel with you back to Bethlehem. And so these 2 ladies pack up everything in Moab, travel back to Bethlehem, and this is where we pick back up in the story as they enter the town of Bethlehem. So in chapter 1, we'll read 19 through 21. It says, so the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So here, as they enter into the town, this is where you hear the depths. We see the depths as readers of the story, knowing that she lost her children, her babies. But then here we get to hear her speak of the depth of her loss. So when she enters back into the town, people know that they most likely have heard of what she has lost. Right? The Israelite community is very tight-knit, so they may most likely have known the loss that she suffered. So when she enters back into the town, people look at her and says, oh, Naomi, are you back? Are you Naomi? And she looks at them and goes, don't call me pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant anymore. My life is anything but pleasant. If anything, it's bitter. If anything, I'm bitter. Call me Mara, which is the word that means bitter. She's like, just call me Mara, because my life has turned out bitter. And look where she blames this bitterness. She blames all of her bitterness on God. She says, in talking with the people around her, she says, the Almighty has dealt with me bitterly, and then the Lord has brought me back empty. This is not Naomi being a nice little church lady here and being like, hey, everything's going to be fine. It's been hard. It's been difficult. No. She looks and squarely puts the blame on God and goes, no, He brought me back bitterly. He dealt with me harshly. He did. She puts all of this directly on God. So she is upset. She's mad. She's disappointed. At the end of the day, she is bitter at the way her life has turned out right now. And it's also very interesting that when she's telling the people, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, call me bitter, that she uses a title of God when she says God Almighty. It's the title El Shaddai. El Shaddai was the title of God that the Hebrew people gave God that would describe his strength, but it would also describe his sovereignty. So it was a title that would include both of these. Now, we talked about it several weeks ago. Sovereignty is a $5 church word that means God is in complete knowledge and complete control of everything that's taking place. So with God's sovereignty, she's acknowledging this God that she is also blaming on this bitterness. He's completely sovereign. He's in complete control and knowledge of everything that has gone on in my life. And so she places all the blame on him, but then she acknowledges that this is the God who's in complete control. So the sovereignty of God for Ruth and for us as well, if God is sovereign, meaning that he's in complete control and he's in complete knowledge of everything that's going on. This means that what Naomi and Ruth are walking through did not catch God by surprise. That when we walk through situations in our life, that what we walk through, tragedy included, that those things do not catch God by surprise. He is in complete knowledge and control of those things. This also means that if God is sovereign, then Naomi understands this, that if he's sovereign, he's in complete control and understanding of what's taking place, that this means that God allows things that take place in our life to take place. If we believe that God is sovereign, he is in complete control, then this means that he allows the things that take place in our life to take place. Naomi, in the midst of all of her emotion, still acknowledges that God is in complete control. This is the God that she believes in, and yet she is still upset with him. She is theologically, as we would say in the church, she is theologically sound in her understanding of God, and yet she is still upset with him. There are moments, there will be moments, if those moments have not taken place, in which you, in your relationship with God, you will be upset, mad, disappointed, sad in the way your life is going, or possibly even in who God is. And you will be frustrated with that. But if God is sovereign, there are no emotions you can have in those situations that's going to catch him off guard. In the midst of tragedy, there's no emotion that you can have in which he's going to say, oh, I wasn't expecting Nate to feel like that. He's in complete knowledge of the emotions that we're going to have when we walk through those difficult situations. So that tells us, and the book of Ruth reminds us, that God can handle those emotions. That God can handle our anger, our frustration, our sadness, our bitterness. He can handle all those things that we may have towards him. So we may have been mad in the past in our relationship, may have been mad at God in our relationship with him in the past. And you may be mad with God in the future in your relationship with him. And that's okay because God can handle your emotions. We see this in Naomi. She looks and says, this is who I am, and this is who I'm looking to as the one in control of it all, and I'm upset with him. But she knows that he's big enough to handle her emotions. So when those emotions come, those times where we get upset, we're mad, or maybe we're even disappointed, and that's not catching him off guard, what the temptation can be at that moment when we feel all of those emotions is we want those emotions to cancel out what we know to be true. And we can allow those emotions to cancel out our trust in the artist. That's the temptation. The encouragement that we see in the story of Naomi in the book of Ruth is that we should not allow our emotions to cancel out our trust in the artist. That if God is in control, if he's truly sovereign, he's in control of all of things and he's in knowledge of all things. That doesn't just include your life. That includes every single person's life around you that's in this room. That includes every single person in this world that is living at this moment. That includes every single person that has lived. That includes every single person that will live. He is in knowledge and control of all of those things. And so if he is the great artist, we can trust him because he is doing things and he is painting in a complexity that we don't fully understand. So if we think back to Bob Ross for a second, Bob Ross starts off with what seems like one or two few colors. We don't know exactly where he is going. But when he finishes it, then we can look back and say, oh, now I see why he did that. In the same way, trusting God as the great artist means that he is doing things in our lives that we cannot fully understand. He is painting with layers and colors that we cannot comprehend, that we cannot see within our own limited vision. He's accomplishing more than what we could possibly think or understand. Now, am I saying that when we're going through difficult times that we cannot be upset with God? Absolutely not. This just person that we see in Naomi here, she is clearly upset with the Lord. But what we do see is that we don't want to allow those emotions to cancel out our trust in the great artist. If we look back in the text, this is what we see. We see this highlighted again. I want to look in verse 22 of chapter 1 because this is where the writer of Ruth highlights the sovereignty of God again. He says, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, we can read that and we just go, oh, that's just a transition between what took place and what's about to take place. But the writer is brilliant in the way that he writes this. He's setting up something for the reader that the characters in the story that are actually living it may not fully see or understand. So he says, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest. He gives a timeline of when it takes place. The way he writes it in the original language is it almost has this air as if he goes, and it just so happens that they came upon Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. It's his way of letting the reader know that the story's not over. We would look at that and be like, she has lost everything. She is grieving. She's bitter. She's mad. Like this is what she's experiencing. But the writer goes, but little does Naomi know that they arrived back at Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. Now, why in the world would he put that in there? How does that enhance the story? Well, fast forward in the story again. They get to chapter 2. They enter into Bethlehem. They begin to settle into Bethlehem and to life there. And one of the provisions that God put in the Old Testament law was when you would plant a field of barley or wheat or whatever it may be, that when it came harvest time, you were to only collect the center of your fields. The outside edges and corners of your field, you were not supposed to harvest. And the reason you were not supposed to harvest them, so those that were orphaned or widow or poor or foreigner could come to the edges of your field and they could harvest the edges of the field, the corners of your field, so that they could have food as well. This is a provision that the Lord put into the law, something that a lot of ancient cultures did not have at this particular time, is this caring for those who are on the lower socioeconomic status. And so this is what God did to provide for the people. So when they get back to Bethlehem, these two women have no one to provide for them. So they get back to Bethlehem, and Naomi looks at Ruth and says, I want you to go out and I want you to gather this wheat, this barley that's in the edge of these fields as they're harvesting it all. And so she sends her out. Ruth goes out and begins to harvest. And then there's this phrase in chapter 2 that Ruth just so happens to come by the field of Boaz. It's a phrase very similar to what we see in chapter 1 of verse 22. Like it's just so happened she came across this field of Boaz. She comes across the field of Boaz. Boaz looks at her and treats her very, very kindly. Shares a meal with her, but then looks at her and says, no, don't just gather on the edges of my field. Go into the middle of my fields and collect all you want. So she is collecting all of this barley, way more than what you would typically collect. And so then she returns home to Naomi to show her everything that she has harvested. And this is where we pick up in chapter 2. We'll look in verses 17 down through 23. So Ruth gleaned in the field until it came evening, and she beat out all what she had gleaned, and was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her some of the food that she had left over after being satisfied with this meal with Boaz that she had. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name who worked today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not been forsaken by the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close to my young men until they have finished all of my harvest." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So keep close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest." And she lived with her mother-in-law. So again, we're seeing this story from the outside. You have the characters of the story. They just so happen upon Bethlehem at this particular time of the barley harvest. She so happens to come across the field of the field of Boaz, and then she collects all of this grain. And so she comes, not knowing who Boaz is, just a nice dude who let her gain all of this wheat, goes to her mother-in-law and says, "Look what all this guy gave us. He gave us way more than what we deserved." And she goes, "Who was it that gave you this?" And she says the name Boaz. This is where he enters into the story. Little does she know the connection of Boaz with Naomi's family. So in verse 20, it says that Boaz is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. So in the Old Testament world, in the Israelite world, there was this title that one had in the family called a kinsman redeemer. This meant that when a family member got into a position, a crisis that they could not get out of, it was the responsibility of the closest family member to redeem them out of that situation. It could be a financial hardship that they're going through. It could go through even, as we will see here, the fact that a lineage of a family cannot carry on. It was the job of the kinsman redeemer to come in and to carry on the family line that was going to continue. And so Ruth comes in and goes, "I met a guy named Boaz." Naomi goes, "This is one of our redeemers." She's making the connection that their situation here could actually turn around. Because within that culture, what could happen if everything played out the way it could happen is Ruth or Boaz could come to Ruth and actually marry Ruth, bring her out from the destitution that she's living in as a widow, to not only provide for her, but by extension, this would provide for Naomi as well, and it would allow the family line to continue on. So the sons of Mahlon and Chilion, like the lineage of Elimelech, this lineage could carry on as they had children according to this law of kinsman redeemer that we see within the Old Testament. And so Naomi begins to connect all of this and realizes that Boaz could be the one that redeems them. And this is actually what happens within the story. That you go on and you read chapter 3, you see Ruth and Boaz actually get married. And then when they get married, you also see that when they get married, they also have a kid. And this kid that they have allows the family line to continue. And the family line that is continued through the redemption of Ruth and through Boaz is a very, very important family line that needs to carry on. So if you flip over to chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, start in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and she gave birth, and she gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed," notice who they're talking to here, Naomi, "blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So we have Naomi's grandson that is born here, Ruth's son, and he becomes the grandfather of the greatest of Israel's kings. So a life that starts in difficulty, ends in, or like travels into tragedy so quickly, all of a sudden the writer of Ruth is going, hey, there is something taking place here through the sovereign God who is painting a picture that they don't fully understand. He is doing something deep here that we fully do not get until we get to the end of the story. Because this family, not only does it produce King David, this is the line that's going to lead to the king. This is the line that's going to bring King Jesus to this earth and begin to push back the forces of evil and bring resurrected new life to this world. So their family lineage now gets tied in with the lineage of King Jesus that is going to come. That is why I say we must be very leery of allowing our emotions to cancel out our trust in the great artist, because God is accomplishing more than what we realize in the moment because He is sovereign. He knows everything. He knows how everything is going to turn out. That's why even in the midst of tragedy, we are called to trust in the artist and how the artist can use tragedy to even be a good thing. That our great artist is using tragedy in a way, in a complexity, in multiple layers in which we do not understand. But yet he is writing a story that occasionally is going to cause us to walk through tragedy, but yet he is weaving all of this together. He can use this, that allows him to even then use tragedies for something that's going to bring about like glory for him and his name and what he is accomplishing within the world. That even within our own life, when we experience tragedy, there is a way in which the King of the universe, the one who is sovereign over all, he can use tragedy to paint a picture that has more depth than what we could ever realize. I've seen it within my own life of how God can do this. So back in 2008, that's when I started a ministry. Started at Okolona, First Baptist Okolona. I was a youth pastor there for about 3 years. And when I started, there was a kid in the youth group. His name was Park. Park was 6'6", 300 pounds. All teddy bear of a human, very large teddy bear, was just massive kid. I'm talking, he was 6'6", 300 in 10th grade. Everybody else is still trying to figure out what their life is going to look like, and you have a behemoth walking around. And Park was unlike any other teenager I've ever been around in my entire life, and especially in my time in ministry, because he was a kid that just knew how to love life. My first year there, in 2008, I didn't have anywhere to live during the summer while I was still in college, and so during the summers I was going to live in Okolona, so I stayed with Park's family. So Park, needless to say, became like a giant little brother to me. And so I remember Park, every time you hung out with Park, he just allowed you to know that life was just so fun. Every small experience was a big experience to Park. So he was the one that taught me. There was a little convenience store that we'd go to. There was the orange sickle, Stewart's orange sickle soda that comes in a glass bottle that you may be familiar with. If you're not, look for it this afternoon or the next week because it'll change your life. So it's a dreamsicle in liquid form, if you know what I'm talking about. It's orange and vanilla flavored drink. Park was the one that introduced me to those. He was the one that taught me how to enjoy that. But everything about Park was just fun. I remember one night we were sitting in a youth group and we were kind of winding down. Everyone was kind of bored. And Park was like, let's have a dance competition. I was like, no, that sounds terrible. Plus, we're Baptist. We can't. I was like, that sounds terrible. We shouldn't do that. Next thing I know, Park puts on some music and he just 300 pounds of him just starts dancing in front of everybody. And everybody's losing it, just laughing at him, having a good time. He was the only one that danced in this dance competition and he didn't care. And he was that kind of kid. He just always brought you into so much joy. But then the thing that really stood out to me was how Park was so tender. He was so tender to the prompting of the Spirit. And one of the things that always shocked me is somebody would come into the youth group, and maybe it was the first, second time, or they were just having a hard day. Park would always seek that person out. Even if he didn't know what was going on. It was like he had this sense about him. The prompting of the Spirit within Park was so deep. He was tender. Like he was this giant of a human, but if you spoke harsh words to him, it would crush him. He was this tender, tender soul. And so my time at Okolona was intricately tied with my relationship with Park and just who he was as a young man. So stepped away from Okolona, went to a church in Memphis, and then in 2013 came to Getwell. In 2013, there was a youth group night that we were getting ready. We were gathering together as a youth group, and I got a phone call or before this, Park, in the meantime, Park, my time at Memphis, Park actually wanted to walk on at Ole Miss to play football. He was a Mississippi State fan, but he played at EMCC, wanted a chance to walk on. So he walked on and actually made the team at Ole Miss under Hugh Freeze at the time. And so he walked on. I remember the day he called me. He's like, Nate, you'll never believe it. He's like, I made the team. I was like, Park, that's incredible. He was like, yeah, but you want to know what's more amazing? And I was like, okay. He was like, they just gave me free clothes, free shoes. He was like, I don't have to wash clothes for this entire week because they gave me a whole new wardrobe. Like, that was what meant the most to him. Was like, he was like, this is what life is all about. Look at all these free clothes I get to wear every single day. Like, this was the spirit of Park every time we talked. And so there was one night that I received a phone call, and Park had left Ole Miss, was headed home for the weekend. I was driving on the road, and he topped a hill, and an 18-wheeler was on the other side, and he hit the 18-wheeler, instantly died. And I remember getting a phone call on that Wednesday night, and the person on the other end told me, hey, Park didn't make it. Park died. This is what happened. And I remember, like, in that moment, and if you've walked through tragedy, you know all of the emotions that begin to come in that moment. The first one that I think popped in my head, I was going, why? Why, Lord? Like, out of everyone that I've ever interacted with, you took the kid that could have changed the world. Like, there was a kid that was so tender to your spirit. He was so willing to do what you asked him to do, even if everybody looked at him and was like, dude, that makes you weird. And he was okay with that. And so I remember walking through it, and I remember being angry with the Lord, being like, you don't get to do that. Like, why do you get to take him? Like, it wasn't supposed to be Park that was going to die that evening. Like, he had his whole life ahead of him. Like, he made his dream of walking on a college football. Like, that's what he had. Like, he was able to do that. And now, like, it's all been stripped away from him. And I remember looking at his parents and watching them just walk through grief. And the whole time, the emotions all there. And you continue to wonder why. And it's not as if you walk through grief, you know, like, it's not as if those emotions just go away. When I sat down to write the sermon, I guess it was just the Lord's providence and going, hey, Father's Day, we're going to marry the story of Naomi together on Father's Day and walk through grief and all this. And I remember just writing this down, and I would just push away from my desk and just have to take a second because all those emotions would still pop up. I'd look over to my right, there's a bookshelf over there. There's a 3-inch tall penguin. It's a ceramic penguin that Park painted for me. And his name's Ronaldo Nunez, still in there. And he has TL on the front of his chest. Stands for Thug Life, because Park thought that this penguin should be a thug life. That's what Pete said Ronaldo Nunez came from. So this was the penguin that I still have in my office. And I would push away from my desk, and I look over that, and I'd be like, man, if only he was still around. Because I'll just go ahead and tell you, I would have stopped at nothing to bring Park to be a part of this. But I just go like, why, Lord, why in your wisdom, in your understanding of how this thing's going to end, why did you take him? And it was writing the sermon that I would have to stop, and I would have to look at the complexity of the guy of the picture that Christ is painting. That when I see things in one dimension, on one layer, God is working in multiple layers of dimension. He is seeing things that I don't fully understand. So he saw the fact that at his funeral, while we were grieving, the entire Ole Miss football team comes to that funeral. Guys that if I said the names, you'd be like, oh my goodness, I know them. Guys who went on into the NFL, like, oh my goodness, I know them. And it was Park, this gentle giant, who he was only there for a semester or so. He was there, made such an impact that the entire football team shows up, and Hugh Freeze presents the gospel for all of them to hear. And they were willing to come and be there. Why? Because it was Park. It was who meant the most to them. Or I see and watch his parents from a distance honor the legacy of Park. That even today, if you wear his number at Ole Miss, it's a big deal. If you go to his high school, there's an award that they give out. It's the Park Stevens Memorial Award that you get if you exemplify the life that Park lived. And I see them honoring his legacy, but even more so than that, I watch them walk other people through unimaginable tragedy all the time. because they're willing, in the loss of their incredible son, to sit in the sorrow of others. And then to watch them have to pour out all that grief once again. It's not as if they're able to sit in others' grief and it doesn't affect them. No, it brings back all the memories of Park, all the things that they wanted for their son, and all of a sudden they can't experience it on this. And they're sitting with them in the midst of all of that grief and all of that tragedy. That even at this moment, when sit down to write and study the book of Ruth and to walk through the life of Naomi, it's immediately Park's story that enters into my head of going, now you unfortunately never got to meet Park. Your life would be better if you had, I promise you. But yet, it's the story of Park that you now get to share in a way to be able to see the picture of God within the world in a way that you wouldn't have seen before. You would have seen Park and be like, incredible human. The Lord's going to do so many amazing things, but now it's looking at like, no, look at the beauty of the artist, even in the midst of tragedy. Look what he is doing. Look how he's weaving things together in ways that we don't understand, that God is way more complex. He is weaving, painting a picture that is more complex than I can understand. And that for us, in the midst of that, this is where we say we experience all of the emotions, but we don't want those emotions to cancel out our trust in the artist. That doesn't mean trust is easy. If trust was easy, it wouldn't be called trust. No, it's even in the midst of that, all of that tragedy, that we're looking upon the face of the great artist and we're trusting in him in the midst of it, that he is doing things that we don't fully understand. We don't know why. Now, Park is getting the benefit at this moment where he has probably met people, or he will meet people, that have come to know Jesus because of him and the life that he lived and the story that he told. And so his perspective is a little bit greater than ours. But even Park is exploring all the greatness of the complexity of the painting that God is painting right now. And so for us, when we walk through that, is to lean in to the great artist that is painting these pictures that don't look like what we expect them to look like. But we're leaning and we're trusting into that. In the midst of our emotions, when we walk through tragedy, that the God that sits with us in those emotions are a God that has walked through those emotions. That he doesn't just look at us and say, hey, you're going to walk through tragedy, you're going to walk through pain, you're going to walk through difficulty. I hope you make it through. As the song we sang, some like to think that God is distant and removed. That is not the God here. That is not El Shaddai. That is not Yahweh Almighty. That is not him. No, he is sitting with us in the midst of all of that tragedy. He is the Father that is there, that is allowing our sorrow to be poured out on him, allowing our grief to be poured out on him, allowing our anger to be poured out on him, because his shoulders can handle it. He can carry that weight. And it's not going to diminish at all who he is. He's going to carry every bit of that as we walk through difficulty within our lives. And he's leaning in as the Father. Not only with us in the midst of all those, but constantly whispering in our ear for us to trust the artist. Trust me, I'm doing things greater than what you could possibly think or dream or imagine. Trust me, I am your Father. So when we end this morning, there's a song that Josh is going to lead us through. New song, it's called Back to Life. The whole premise of the song is that because of the resurrection of Jesus, we've been brought back to life both now and forever, and that death does not get the final say. That even in death, even that evening that Park passed away, he experienced, in ways that we don't understand right now, the victory over death when he stepped into the presence of the Jesus that he'd been following. So as we end, some of us this morning, you may be in a place where you just need to weep. You've lost someone. You've been walking through that. It was 10 years ago, but the grief of that is still there. That you may just need to sit and weep and allow the Spirit of God to comfort you. One of the things that Jesus says pointedly is, I'm sending to you the great comforter. That's the title of one of the titles that he gives of the Holy Spirit. I think he knows that the reason he was going, I'm going to give them the comfort because their lives are going to be walking through tragedy. And so we need to sit and allow the comforter to comfort us. There's some of us in here Maybe we want to stand and worship the God who's writing a story bigger than what we could possibly understand within our own lives. Just be thankful that he's doing that. There's some of us in here, we haven't walked through tragedy, the depths of tragedy that others in this room, or like even within our own lives. We've been fortunate. We haven't had to walk through a ton of tragedy. Maybe we want to spend time in prayer asking the Lord, like, Lord, prepare me to trust in you when the moment comes. So we've got altar rails down here. If you want to have a time of prayer, I'm here at the front. If you just want somebody to pray over you, I'd be more than glad to do that. If you want to grab somebody around you to pray over you, then do that. I don't know how the Spirit of God is wanting you to respond to the story of Naomi. But I do know that the story of Naomi and the book of Ruth was given to us so that we could understand that Naomi was just a person, but the Lord used her in mighty ways. And that to be an encouragement to us this morning. So as Josh and his team come in a moment to lead us in that, I'm going to pray over us, but then when I say amen, I want you to respond however you see fit. Sit, stand, kneel, pray, sing, sit silently. It doesn't matter. Just respond as you feel like the Holy Spirit's leading you to respond. So let's pray together.